Thank you very much indeed, Damon, and welcome everybody, and thank you very much for attending this talk. This is basically a continuation of a talk I gave at the Theosophical Society Spring Conference at Hills Court in Birmingham a few weeks ago. There is a link in the chat box to that particular talk, but obviously what I'm going to do briefly before I do the rest of it is to just briefly reprise some of this material, which basically concentrates on a central theosophical idea, which is the importance of cycles, very long cycles, some lasting trillions of years and others lasting a tiny fraction of a second. And I want to try and illustrate how at different points in different cycles, we see tumultuous changes as we're seeing at the moment. And I'll try and explain what I believe are some of the reasons for that. And then I'm going to do something which is quite dangerous, really. And this is to try and anticipate what future developments might lie in this new age, which we're entering into, the age of Aquarius, as it's known. In the past, many people have tried to predict the future. Back in the 20th century, we had writers like George Orwell and Aldous Huxley, and some of their ideas, along with Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, have come to some sort of fruition. But we're all, many of us, of an age. And when we were born in the 1940s, 50s, or 60s, it would have been absolutely impossible to predict the huge social, economic, and all the other changes in attitude and behavior which have taken place during our lifetimes. And during our lifetimes, we've seen the population of the world increase by 300%. It's gone up threefold, from 2.5 to more than 7.5 billion people. Attitudes have completely changed, as I say, and so many of other things. And our lives now are much more shaped by technology than they ever were in the past. Some people's lives are completely dominated by technology. One of the people I find quite interesting is a woman here called Mother Shipton. She lived in a cave in a place called Knaresborough, which is a few miles from where I live here in Yorkshire. And in the 15th century, when she was operating, she predicted that people would fly and that they will be able to communicate instantaneously with each other across the planet. So some people, her and Nostradamus and other people, have been able to look at some particular aspects of the future, perhaps in very vague terms. But it's a very dangerous business because we live in such an interconnected and complex world with so many interlocking systems. Trying to predict anything is very, very difficult. So my predictions are really based, some of them are fairly obvious, to be honest with you, but they're based on what insights I've had and the insights of some other writers. Well, let's start with this idea of cycles. You know, everything operates in cycles. Our own individual lives operate in cycles. The cycle of a flower or an atom or a galaxy, it's all precisely the same. The entity is born, it comes into physical existence. It goes through a period of growth and reaches a stage of maturity, after which a period of decline sets in, the death of the physical form, a period out of physical existence, and then rebirth of some kind. And this applies to absolutely everything. Now, as theosophists, we talk about a lot of different cycles. We talk, for example, about the main development groups of humanity, which we call root races. Each of these is divided into sub-races. Each of the sub-races is divided into branch races, and there are further divisions beyond that. As we know, we are in the 5th sub-race of the 5th root race, and there are totally 7 races before the end of this particular cycle. So we're somewhere beyond the midpoint of that particular cycle. I know that you'll all be thoroughly familiar with the ideas surrounding chains and globes and rounds. So we won't dwell on this in particular because we're dealing with such massive amounts of time. It's very difficult for people often to understand that. But basically, we are part of a system that's of 7 globes, but not all these globes are in physical manifestation. But you can read this up. It's far better for you to read it than for me to try and explain it now. Another interesting set of cycles, of course, are the Yugas, which are derived from the Hindu religion. And we are currently in the Kali Yuga, which is known as the Dark Age or the Iron Age. It's a period of time, 432,000 years, and it's said by some that we're only 5,000 years into this. Now, before that, there was the Bronze Age, the Dwapara Yuga, which lasts exactly twice as long as the Kali Yuga, 864,000 years. Before that, the Silver Age, the Treta Yuga, which is 3 times as long at 1.29 million years. And before that, there was the Golden Age, which was 4 times the length of this, 1.728 million years. So the Yugas are said to represent a kind of series of phases of involution. And it's said that since the Satya Yuga, we've progressively lost touch with the higher parts of ourselves. During each of these eras, our higher selves or aspects of our higher selves have been progressively stripped away. And so now we're only dimly aware of our physical bodies and not much else. I mean, this is a very extreme way of stating it. And these periods of time may be more symbolic than actual. And then you get into the really big stuff. When you start putting the yugas together, you get a day of Brahma, which is 1,000 yugas, which is 4.3 billion years. You get an age of a year of Brahma, which is a multiplication of this, and then an age of Brahma, which is 100 years. And you're talking about 311 trillion years. Well, given the fact that science only accepts that the universe is 14 billion years old, this is very, very difficult for people to understand. One of the cycles which I think is operating very strongly at the moment, and which I'd like to dwell on a little bit more, is what is known as the precession of the equinoxes. Many of you will be familiar with this, but we'll just explain in basic detail what it's all about. This is a cycle which lasts just short of 26,000 years. The figure that I'll ascribe to it is 25,920 years, but other writers ascribe different amounts of time to it. Madame Blavatsky put it at 25,868 years. The writer Graham Hancock puts it at 25,776. So there's no clear definition of this, but another problem we have with it is there is also no agreement as to precisely when these cycles start and end. So for the purposes of this talk, I'm saying that the age of Pisces, the age which we're exiting, began round about the year 0, and the age of Aquarius will come in about 140 years' time, in 2160 rather. So we have this long cycle, and this is further divided into 12 ages, which correspond to the signs of the zodiac. So each of these ages is 2,160 years. Now, the important thing to remember is that these cycles are not end on. One age doesn't end one day and the next age start the next day. There is a long crossover period. And at certain points in this transitional period, you get conflicting energies, because the energies and the forces of one age are very, very different from the forces of other ages. If we go back and we look at this, it's quite interesting, because it is said that the present cycle began 6 ages ago, and this would have been roughly at the time when Atlantis sank, when there were great floods on the earth and huge major changes going on. Not only do we see changes from the transition from one age to another, we also see even greater changes when we come to the equinoxes and the solstice points. And we are at the solstice point at the moment. We are halfway through this cycle, 6 ages, as we make the transition from Pisces into Aquarius. Pisces was an age which was ruled, amongst other things, by the 6th ray of devotion. And we can certainly see this when we look at the age. Whereas the incoming cycle of Aquarius has a lot more 7th ray in it. And the 7th ray is ceremonial, magic, and order. It's a synthesis of all the other rays. So you can see that each age is flavored and colored by the nature of the rays and other influences and forces which govern it. And these are going to, at some time, be hostile to each other. They're going to produce conflict. They're going to produce disharmony. And it's quite clear that the world that we live in at the moment is a very dislocated place on all sorts of levels. I'm not just talking about the obvious wars that are going on. I'm talking about all the other upheavals which are taking place on this planet. Obviously, climate change is something that people address all the time. We have a very unstable financial system in the world. We have a lack of food security. And certainly a lot of people are facing the future with a great deal of fear. And this is not good at all, but we'll deal with that a little bit later on. Now, each of these ages can be also subdivided in various other ways. You can divide them in halves or sevenths or thirds. If we divide these periods of 2,160 years into thirds, for example, we get 3 portions of 720 years. The first third tends to be a cultural implementation of the knowledge and understanding gained during the previous era. The second stage is a period of adaptation to that. And the third stage is all about disintegration over quite a long period of time. So if we look at some of the ages which have preceded us, let's start, for example, with the age of Taurus, which ran from 4320 BC to 2160 BC. This was the spring equinox, and it led all across the world to re-emergence of cultures. It was the first time of really organized agriculture. It was also a time of megalith building. This is the time when the pyramids and Stonehenge and Newgrange and many others were constructed. It was also, the bull from Taurus was at the center of religious symbolism in many parts, notably in the Mithraic cult of Crete. But nature worship at this point still prevailed. We come into the next stage, Aries, which lasted from 2160 BCE to approximately the year 0. So this is the age of the ram. It's a time of solar worship. And we can see this as one example with the Egyptians and others. And interestingly, this is the time when priesthoods first start to be introduced. So religions have an intermediary force to connect them to the divine. They don't do it directly anymore. They have to have this middleman in the form of the priests. It was quite a time of harsh mentality when we look at the Spartans or the Romans, and there were many warlords and many conflicts taking place. During the last third of this particular period, the time supposedly of disintegration, we see huge influences starting to appear around the world. Around 500 BCE, we see key figures, Buddha in India, Pythagoras, Socrates, Plato in ancient Greece, Lao Tzu and Confucius in China. And their influences all continue to this day. They still have a great deal of resonance. And this time also saw the height of classical Greece and Athenian democracy, for example. And then we move into the Piscean age, which we're at the tail end of right now. This is more about lunar orientation, and it's led, amongst many other things, to much wider public education over time. The prevailing religion, of course, certainly in the West, was Christianity, which also has achieved a global influence. At the 1/3 point, round about 700 AD, we see the emergence and the rapid spread of Islam across the Middle East and beyond into Africa and into Asia. By the 2/3 point, when we get into the 15th century, really interesting things start to happen, and we start to see an acceleration of all kinds of things. The influence of Christianity starts to wane to some degree, although it still has huge influence and it's still trying to evangelize around the world. But the church splits. You know, we get the Reformation and the Protestant churches emerging. The printing press, one of the most important human developments ever, emerges. The Renaissance unfolds in Italy, followed by the rise of science and the age of enlightenment and the age of reason. This is a time of global exploration and conquest by European nations. Some people now call this exploitation, but we won't put any value on that particularly. And then all these events gradually work together to produce the Industrial Revolution 250 years ago, which obviously has had a tremendously positive and negative effect upon the planet. But also in the 14th century, just if we take a microcosm of that, here in Britain, it was a tumultuous time, and there were wars going on. There were famines followed by cold, floods and more famines. Then there were a series of plagues culminating in the Black Death, which decimated the population by a half in the UK. This, of course, led to huge social change because so many people had died. There weren't enough people to work the land. Bonded labor, serfs, and etc. gradually began to vanish. So we can see how at different points certain events converge and certain events unfold because of the conflicts which are taking place. Which is why, although things look extremely grim at the moment, and people for the first time since the Cuban Missile Crisis are talking about the possibility, the horrible possibility of nuclear weapons being used, a lot of people are extremely terrified by the future, but I don't think we should be. Because at the end of the Piscean age, and this is something that my former good friend, the late John Gordon, used to talk about. He says that planetary consciousness receives a huge evolutionary jolt at the end of this particular cycle. And he believed that this had led to a major spiritual reorientation, if you want, during the 20th century. And he said that this happened one age or 2,000 years earlier than was planned in the scheme of things. Now, that's his view, and it's an interesting one because we are, as I said earlier on, now at the summer solstice point in this precessionary cycle. We're exactly halfway through it. And one of the things that he and others have predicted, and I'll deal with this in more detail in just a moment, is this idea that there is going to be some kind of major reduction in the world population. Exactly how this will take place is not clear. I mean, there could be a number of mechanisms for this to actually happen. But John Gordon suggested, and not everyone will be comfortable with this particular idea, but what he suggested was that there would be some kind of sympathetic reaction of nature to human activity. But he also suggested that there would be what he called a culling of those who'd not made the evolutionary grade. Now, this means that people who've not reached a particular point of development may well be held back out of incarnation. I have no idea whether these ideas are true or not, but they're certainly very, very interesting to explore. I think the flavor of the Aquarian age will be one of much greater self-realization on the part of individuals. And it'll be a time when we have a much more Gnostic, direct connection with the divine. Old types of religious worship, I suspect, will gradually atrophy and become increasingly redundant, although this will take a considerable amount of time. So, one of the things that is also talked about in each new age, and I'll deal with this in just a moment, is the emergence of an avatar, a leading religious or spiritual figure, as well as the appearance of advanced beings, or masters, as we call them in the Theosophical Society. We'll explore this in greater detail in just a moment, but I think it's also good to look at some of the other things that may well be on the agenda for this new age, apart from chaos and panic and degradation and conflict. So one of the things that I think many people have spoken about is the re-emergence of the mystery schools which existed all over the place. These schools thrived for many millennia across the planet, particularly in ancient Egypt, Greece, India, the Middle East, Babylon, Chaldea, throughout Vedic India and the Himalayas, and also in South America. And the pyramids, Stonehenge, ruined Greek temples may well have hosted some of these schools, and they're certainly testimony to their power and huge influence. The central role of all these mystery schools in all the locations was to focus on death and the awakening of the soul. And via various forms of very realistic ritual, they provided detailed route maps for personal spiritual evolution, transformation, and for enlightenment of one kind or another. And in many cases, these psychodramas were very lengthy and very elaborate, sometimes lasting 2 or 3 days. A candidate for initiation, for example, would find themselves placed in a stone sarcophagus, reenacting a highly realistic after-death journey. And sometimes they use very powerful drugs to enhance these lengthy, symbolic death journeys. So, although the schools were aimed often at the elites and the influential members of society, the Greek mysteries, for example, were open to a great many citizens, not all, but many. And in Greece, the philosopher Plato, the mathematician Pythagoras, and the historian Herodotus all passed through the doors of these mystery schools. And most of them, wherever they were, demanded a binding oath of secrecy as to the information and the knowledge that they would give out. And anyone revealing the secrets to the profane or to the uninitiated, or who happened to stray into their hallowed portals at some point, was often punished very severely, sometimes by death. That's how important these secrets were. In Greece and elsewhere, the mysteries were mainly divided into 2 divisions, the lesser mysteries and the greater mysteries. The lesser were aimed at the neophytes and involved preparing the candidate for a particular path via study and a close focus on emotional and physical purification. The greater mysteries, as you might expect, were for the more advanced candidates who'd already passed through the lesser mysteries. And this particular strand, the greater mysteries, tended to put the emphasis on consciously accelerating one's own development, so that people regarded themselves as evolving and awakening souls. And they also now regarded themselves not just as individuals anymore, but as something that we talk a lot about in Theosophy, as part of the one life. Because this is what we teach in Theosophy. There is one life. We are all just fragments of it, happening to be in physical bodies on planet Earth at this time. And these schools involve the study of all kinds of esoteric secrets, depending on their particular locations. One common assertion is that these mystery schools finally closed their doors in the 3rd or 4th centuries. In 396, the last of the Greco-Roman mystery schools was destroyed by the invading Goth army. And then the knowledge they transmitted went silently underground to be revived in diluted form by various groups, possibly by the Knights Templar, the Rosicrucians, the Freemasons, and others. Whether these schools absolutely closed and whether they stopped operating is a moot point, because perhaps they did operate in greater secrecy than anyone knows. Now, one person who wrote quite a lot about this is the esoteric writer Alice Bailey, who of course channeled the works of Djwhal Khul, DK, Master DK, otherwise known as the Tibetan. And she wrote this about the mystery schools. The mysteries, when finally restored, will make real, in a sense incomprehensible to you at present, the nature of religion, the purpose of science, and the goal of education. These are not what you think today. Well, those are quite enigmatic comments from her. And she strongly suggests the eventual, although perhaps not the imminent, re-emergence of the mystery schools. And she proposed that these updated and rejuvenated schools would focus on planetary rather than just personal change, to create a world of compassion, of universal spirituality, and of love. And this is quite significant. It goes from the personal to the collective. And I think this is quite a significant thing for the Aquarian age. She suggested that the new schools would be put in locations strongly associated with their historic predecessors and possibly connected to historic monuments, ancient temples, and other sacred sites of initiation. And she said that they would form part of a global network. Let's not forget she was writing this sort of stuff 80, 90 years ago, long before our current ideas and notions and realities of what global interconnectedness is all about. It's proposed that the new mystery schools will possibly reflect the lesser and greater mysteries of their predecessors, which we saw in antiquity. So the former, the lesser, would be preparatory schools for people with only a novice level of knowledge. And the teaching would be that each individual is an eternal, evolving soul on a voyage of discovery. And the aim will be to produce fully integrated individuals who are whole, independent, and service-driven. Of course, this is exactly what we try to do within the Theosophical Society. This is the core of what Theosophy is all about this personal evolutionary journey and part of a much wider evolutionary stream. So the idea is to produce fully integrated individuals who are whole, independent, and crucially service-driven. And the greater mysteries will develop this idea further to explore deeper levels of being with the ultimate aim of uniting and reconciling the lower self, the personality, with the higher self, soul, or the individuality, to create new creativity and purpose. We talk about this in Theosophy, Antakarana, the bridge between the higher and the lower self. So perhaps this revival is underway in various clandestine settings and possibly enshrouded in secrecy. Possibly, as I say, these schools never completely disappeared, because this knowledge, although it goes underground, it's never lost. It might be dormant for a considerable period of time, but sometimes unpredictable events or the necessity of a particular time in history stimulates the reappearance of these things. But it does seem that humanity is destined for some kind of new individualized world wisdom religion, in which the evolution of the soul is put at center stage. Now, another interesting development, which has been alluded to by a number of people, certainly Alice Bailey talked about this, and certainly the second generation theosophist Charles Leadbeater talked about this to some degree. And this is closer contact with other kingdoms, principally the Devic or angelic kingdom, which is above the human kingdom, and then the three elemental kingdoms, which are below the mineral kingdom. By elementals, I'm also going to be talking about nature spirits, because unseen and unrecognized by the vast majority of people, there is a hidden commonwealth of invisible, non-human entities which create, protect, preserve all life forms throughout all nature's kingdoms. And these are unseen empires, and they're widely referred to throughout the theosophical literature, but it's something these days which isn't discussed all that often. So we have vast hierarchies of nature spirits operating in the four elements of air, earth, fire, and water. And they operate not on the physical level, but principally on the etheric and astral levels. Every flower has nature spirits working on it. Nature spirits help during a woman's pregnancy, when the fetus is being formed and the new baby is growing inside the mother's womb. They play a part in all these things and all other processes of creation and renewal within nature. And then at a higher level, beyond the human kingdom, at the superhuman stage, if we might call it that, are even more powerful creative figures. The Devas, which is a Sanskrit word translated usually as shining ones. In Christianity and other faiths, they're sometimes referred to as angels. And these tend to operate on the astral and mental planes. And this obviously explains why these spirits are very, very hard to see, because you can't normally see them with your physical senses. A number of clairvoyant people and key theosophists such as Geoffrey Hodson wrote many books about these, and they're very interesting books to read. And there is a new emergent literature now talking about nature spirits in traditions across the world, because they feature prominently throughout all cultural and religious traditions, particularly in the Native American tradition, particularly in African cultures as well, and especially in Hinduism, where they talk about 330 million different spirits and everything. So without these hosts, these hidden hosts, which nobody recognizes or understands or even accepts, there would be no life as we know it. So they keep us alive and they heal disease. And as I say, they are central to human and other reproduction. And they operate on animals, plants, and the mineral realms, right across every kingdom of nature. And they often play a part in the weather as well. Also in natural disasters, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions. And all these things appear very prominently in the myths and the legends and the religions and folklore of virtually all cultures and all epochs. But now they're completely forgotten in the modern materialistic world of technology and industrialization, materialism, and the move of people from the countryside into towns and cities has all conspired to really drive these things to the margin. Now, most people just regard these things as crude superstitions of primitive people, and that's why they're completely ignored. But I believe that they are one of humanity's most important allies. And in the coming decades and centuries, I think that we're destined to rediscover and to cooperate much more widely with these kingdoms. In fact, they may be the pivot, they may hold the key to solving a lot of the problems that this world faces at the moment. But the chief difficulty here is when most people don't believe in them. If you are in ordinary society and you start saying to people, look, there are fairies at the bottom of my garden, they're probably going to pick up the phone and call the nearest psychiatric hospital, aren't they? But nevertheless, these things can be perceived by certain people. And often you don't need to be a clairvoyant to perceive them. They can be perceived in much more subtle ways. Often if you're, for example, walking through a wood in summer and something just brushes against your face, or you see something just disappearing behind a bush, or you get the scent of a particular flower, or you hear the sound of a stream running, these can all be signs of that. When you're out on a windswept moorland, which we have a lot of near where I live, you can often hear these voices in the wind, you can hear it in the sea, but you have to be attuned to it to some degree. You have to have a degree of acceptance that these kingdoms are actually there. And this quite inevitably involves a bit of a leap of faith for a lot of people. So our rediscovery, our acceptance, and our possible cooperation with these kingdoms will be very, very interesting. But I guess that some aspects of the nature spirits, possibly the devas as well, may be extremely unhappy with human beings' stewardship of this planet and the way that we have abused it, we've depleted its resources, we've poisoned its oceans and skies, and we've done all sorts of other things in terms of mineral extraction, metal extraction, which may have caused all kinds of damage, along with ozone damage and other things as well. So there may be a trust issue between these kingdoms and the human kingdom. How we solve this, I don't know. But I do suspect that this is going to be one of the principal things on the agenda for this new age. Let's elaborate a little bit more now on this idea that mainstream religions may not in the future have the same influence that they do today. Religions are very, very tenacious things. They change with an almost geologically slow time frame sometimes. When we look, for example, at the Catholic Church, which has been besmirched by scandal after scandal after scandal, and yet more than 1 billion people around the world still very much buy into this faith. And every Sunday, thousands gather in St. Peter's Square to hear the Pope talking about things and to have his blessing. So despite all the things that religions of all kinds have got up to over the years, and particularly the role of Christianity in subverting and destroying many of the cultures of countries that were conquered by its followers. When you look at some of the heinous crimes that were committed here, you look at the things that happened in children's homes in Ireland and Canada and Australia and elsewhere, and you see almost on a weekly basis further scandals unfolding. It doesn't actually seem to dent people's faith. So if that doesn't, what will actually change things? And I suspect it will be something that I'm going to deal with in just a moment. And this is a new spiritual consciousness amongst people. I think we live in a world now where in the dying embers of the Piscean age, this age of devotion, it seems often that fanaticism has reached a kind of epidemic proportion at the moment. And it's difficult to imagine many of the world's Christian or other religious fundamentalists suddenly abandoning their crude and dogmatic and literal interpretation of their ideas and scriptures. And I think that over time, over the next centuries, the emergent wisdom religion, because that's what it'll be, will bear little resemblance to the established world religions as they currently operate. You know, this idea of devotion, this idea of worship, rather than of self-development. It may grow very, very gradually, and I suspect in the early stages, which are now forming, which are now happening, it will only be for relatively small minorities of people, not for the mass of humanity. But over time, I think it will have an impact, but it will take time, and there will be progress and reversals and so on. So of course, these religions will be around for another few centuries, but over time, as all religions, they will become something else. So we're now at a point where 1400 years after the formation of Islam, Islam has possibly reached the same kind of crossroads that Christianity did at its 1400-year mark, when it had crusades and inquisitions and all sorts of other things. So it'll be interesting to see how this actually develops and what will happen in the subsequent decades and centuries. And of course, religions like Hinduism, which is one of the oldest surviving spiritual systems, and it's possibly a way of life rather than a religion. And this is still center stage for hundreds of millions of Indians and their descendants abroad. And obviously Buddhism, very old religion, 2,500 years, still remains very vibrant for many, many people. But I think the primary purpose of any new wisdom religion is to teach the essential and the crucial message that human beings are first and foremost souls who happen to be in physical form. And more importantly, they have to overcome this Christian idea that everybody's wicked and guilty sinners who are going to be punished by some kind of vengeful God and should feel guilty for being born in the first place. But we should see ourselves rather as evolving souls, aiming for divine status and rising and falling through our own efforts, not through those of an external power. And central to its teachings, I think, will be the true nature of death and rebirth, karma and reincarnation, and the idea that all human beings are entwined in an everlasting, interconnected continuum, which is modified and molded by karma, the law, cause and effect. We've already dealt with the major reduction in population. And I think to go along with this, what we're actually seeing now is quite interesting, because many of the children who are being born today, not all of them, but many of them are nothing like their parents or their grandparents. They seem to be more intelligent, more empathic, more compassionate, and crucially more intuitive. And they don't like the old learning methods of sitting in rows and learning things from a teacher standing by a blackboard. Therefore, they tend to be often diagnosed with psychological conditions such as ADHD and other things. And possibly these people who are coming into incarnation at the moment now are the prototypes of this sixth subrace, which will emerge more fully in the next decades and centuries. So perhaps because of all the doom mongering that we see in the world at the moment, there's this kind of millennial and almost apocalyptic mood which enshrouds this planet at the moment. And many people, perhaps encouraged by the many films from Hollywood, are luridly thinking about these very dark and sinister end of days scenarios. Let's hope the future doesn't look like something out of a Mad Max movie, but something a little bit more positive. But there does seem to be this idea which has been floated and which seems to be lodging in popular consciousness, that the Earth does need a period of recovery, that it does need somehow to reduce its population. And it may decide to do this, as I said earlier on, in a number of different ways. Now, another thing which we mentioned a little bit earlier on is the appearance of a new avatar or world teacher. Avatar actually is a Sanskrit word which means descent, and it indicates a being of high authority who comes down to earth to impart wisdom. And there have been many of these in the past. Many Christians believe in the second coming of Jesus Christ. And Kalki is the proposed 10th incarnation of the Hindu god Vishnu, and he's destined to appear at the end of the Kali Yuga. But if the figures we mentioned earlier are true, it's going to be another 427,000 years before he tips up for the party. For people of the Islamic faith, Muhammad was the final prophet of Islam. And Buddhists talk about Maitreya, who seems to be another key candidate who will incarnate as the next Buddha. And he will be a bodhisattva or person on the path to Buddhahood. And he'll appear, it's said, at some indeterminate future date to achieve enlightenment and teach humanity the true Dharma, which is a word which is quite difficult to translate in English, but means righteousness or merit or duty or various other things. So there are all these possibilities, and yet the avatar, if he or she appears, will probably appear in the most unusual way. But alongside the avatar, a number of writers over the years have talked about the appearance of adepts and wise beings. Now, of course, in theosophy, we talk a lot about this. We talk about the masters of wisdom, the Trans-Himalayan Brotherhood, and various other names that it goes by. A number of very enlightened individuals who overshadow people, who take responsibility for different aspects of human endeavor and progress. Obviously, the most well-known ones are Moria and Kuthumi, who communicated with Madame Blavatsky and other early theosophists. There's DK, we mentioned earlier on, who overshadowed the work of Alice Bailey. These masters of wisdom are said to overshadow people rather than be in direct communication with them. And it also appears from everything that we read that there is a huge reluctance on their part to directly intervene in human affairs unless it becomes absolutely necessary, because otherwise this infringes human free will. It is said that they were prompted to intervene during the First World War when the number of shells going off was so huge that it was threatening to damage the etheric body of the Earth itself, but they didn't. So these masters, and it's not clear how many of them there are, we talk about many of them, the Master Jupiter, the Master Rakotsi, various others in different parts of the world with different spheres of responsibilities. And for a number of decades now, quite a few people have speculated that in this coming era, these masters will cease operating so covertly and may take a more visible role in the world. Personally, I doubt whether this is going to be the case, but it is something that comes up again and again, and people do predict this. And of course, one of the things which makes life very difficult these days is that the internet is absolutely awash with millions of pages purporting to be the channeled wisdom of Master X or Master Z. And there are whole ecosystems of elevated entities imparting their wisdom. So it's very difficult sometimes. And we have to use our sense of discrimination to know what to believe and not to believe. Okay, just to wind up, just one or two other brief headlines of things that I think may start to unfold. We are going to see major planetary upheavals because there's never been a time in human history when these haven't happened. Obviously, we live in a world where we believe that there should be some kind of stability and technology should be able to stop this, but I doubt whether that will ever be the case. We're going to see, as we have done during the 20th century, a big increase in people's mental intelligence. People are much more intelligent now than they were 100 years ago. And people over time, not as quickly as they're developing mental intelligence, are beginning to develop a kind of emotional intelligence. And this is something we should be teaching in schools, emotional intelligence, because as we know in Theosophy, we talk about kama manas, the desire mind, the monkey mind that is just driven by the desires of the lower personality. And I think it's a major spiritual task for us to try and get these things under control. And I have to tell you, I have particular difficulty with these areas. We will, of course, see new economic, social, and political structures emerging because these always change over time. I think we will connect with people from other worlds if we haven't already. I don't know whether any of you watch these programs about alien encounters, but I watch them all the time and I find them very, very interesting. And well, the American government might say that we're not in contact with these beings. But if so, why did they declassify 26 million pages of documents a few years ago, showing that they didn't exist? Anyway, we'll leave that. Perhaps the most important thing, which we will develop collectively over the coming decades and centuries, are what we talk about in the third object of Theosophy, the latent powers in human beings. We are immensely powerful people. We regard ourselves often with a huge degree of self-limitation, but we have immense capacities that we simply don't know about. And the next thing we're going to develop, which will become as acute, if you can call it that, as our five physical senses, is the sixth sense, which corresponds to our sixth Buddhic wisdom, intuition principle. This is something which humanity will start to develop very much. Not everybody, but certainly, as I mentioned earlier on, children are now coming into incarnation, showing a marked increase in this. And what this means is that when we have this capacity, we are absorbing knowledge and information, and it bypasses the intellectual mind. It's not filtered through the mental process, it comes direct. A lot of people have intuition, but they dismiss it. They say, oh, it's just my imagination, just my imagination. We have nothing more powerful than our imaginations. So we should trust these feelings. In a crude way, they sometimes come into our solar plexus as just hunches or ideas and everything. But eventually that becomes a bit more sophisticated. But we have to learn to recognize when we are tapping in to those areas beyond ourselves. So there are one or two other things I could mention, but I think I've spoken for rather longer than I should have done. And thank you very much indeed for listening.